All right. Well, it's good to be back. I've been here and there and wherever else for the last 3 or 4 weeks, and I will have to admit, and I'm not actually exaggerating, whenever I take a break from preaching and then I get back into the pulpit, about a day or two before that, I have this intense panic because I just forget how to preach. And it's this moment of, oh man, what do I do? But thankfully, this is the third time this weekend, so I don't know. I feel a little more limber, or however that works. Anyway, as I said at the beginning of the service, we are still in our series called Impact. And this time we are looking at what happens when God does something new. And we're looking at that through the lens of Acts 18 and Colossians 3, which you just heard read. And at the outset, Acts 18 and Colossians 3 have nothing to do with each other, other than Paul wrote Colossians and Paul is the subject of Acts 18. But we'll see as we start digging a little deeper into it that in both, God is doing something new. And as it turns out, God is doing something new in very different ways, in different senses of the term. So hopefully as we walk back through it, you'll get this sense of what does it mean for God to be doing something new or taking us with him. So Acts 18, after this. Now what is this? This would be what Pastor Christensen preached on last week, Paul in Athens. So Paul leaves Athens, and he went to Corinth. And there he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Now, Aquila and Priscilla are big names. They come up a couple of times in the New Testament. They were obviously leaders in the earliest of churches. They lived in Rome. Until the emperor, Claudius, expelled all Jewish people from the city of Rome. Now we get a better sense of what happened and why he did this from a Roman writer. His name is Suetonius, if you're ever on Jeopardy or whatever. But he points out that, and you kind of have to read into it a little bit, that this message of the gospel, that the Jewish Messiah had come, that his name was Yeshua, he was from Nazareth, he suffered the shame of the cross, and God raised him from the dead, which demonstrated that he was in fact Messiah. Well, this story had finally reached the city of Rome, and it was really divisive amongst the Jewish community. So divisive that it caused turmoil and disruption of peace, which is the thing that Rome fears most. And so Emperor Claudius said, all right, everybody out. This would be in the early 50s, or late 40s, early 50s AD. So Priscilla and Aquila end up in Corinth, and there they meet Paul. Now, as it turns out, the Jewish people who were forced to leave Rome were eventually allowed to come back, and it sets up a problem. Because all of these Gentile Christians, so non-Jewish people who believe in Jesus, had been living for quite some time as the church and living out their faith. And then these Jewish believers in Jesus return, and now these two communities have to figure out how to do life and faith and church together. And that got really complicated. And as it turns out, that's why Paul wrote his most important book, which is the book of Romans. So that's the rest of that story. So Paul meets up with them, and because he is a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. So Paul's trade is at tent making. That's how he supports himself. Excuse me. And as we've seen all throughout Acts, the first thing Paul does when he gets to a city is he goes into the synagogue and says, good news, our Messiah has come. His name is Jesus. God has finally done what he promised he would do. And this Messiah was killed, and he bore the sin and weight of the world. And this sin and darkness died with him. And when God raised him from the dead, this new era has dawned. Good news. So he would say that to the Jewish people and the Greeks who were part of the synagogue, who were interested in this whole God thing, the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs. The Gentile people were interested in this faith. So when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." So Paul's friends and companions, Silas and Timothy, come, and they either brought money or then they worked to support Paul so that he could full-time do whatever it is he does. But at some point, he hits this wall, and his fellow Jews, the people of the covenant, are refusing to believe that Jesus was in fact the one that they have been waiting for. And it seems a little ridiculous that Paul then has this moment where he's like, "Your blood be on your own hands. I'm innocent. I'm out of here." That would be like me spending maybe 6 months here as your pastor, and I'm trying to get some kind of point across, and you guys just are not buying what I'm selling. And I finally say, I get up from the pulpit, you know what? Your blood's on your own heads. I'm out of here. I'm taking a call somewhere else. You might think, maybe something else is going on in Eric's life, because, wow, that's a really extreme reaction. And as we're going to see in a minute, I think it's because Paul's heart was breaking over his people. But hold that thought. Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, which, if you know anybody who's pregnant and in need of a name for a boy, just think, no one will be able to spell it. A worshiper of God. So he's Gentile, and that's obviously a Roman name, but he's interested in the God of Abraham, the God of creation. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who had heard Paul believed and were baptized. This is a bit of an awkward situation. So Paul leaves the synagogue and he sets up camp next door. And houses were not spread out. In fact, they were probably closer than they are even here in Southern California. So he sets up shop next door, which I'm guessing was awkward. And even weirder, the leader of the synagogue comes to believe in Jesus. So I guess there's a turf war or something like that going on. Now, if you take a step back and see that Paul is not only going to just the Gentiles, but he is the last person you would expect to be the one to bring the good news of Jesus to the Gentiles. He was, as he called himself, like a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was not just a Pharisee. The Pharisees were kind of diverse and definitely divided. He was almost certainly from the strictest of the Pharisaic schools. He knew his Bible better than any of us could imagine. And he was zealous and energized. And he wanted to make sure that his people, his fellow Jews, were pure in their practice. They were following God. They were following Torah, his law. And when he heard that there was this weird sect that followed this Nazarene who claimed to be the Messiah, well, that just will not do, to the point where he got special permission to jail them. So he is then the last person you would ever expect to have this moment where this Jesus reveals himself on the road, and now he follows Jesus. Now, of course, he then spends a lot of time working with his fellow Jews and arguing that he really is the Messiah. And then we have something even weirder. This guy whose pedigree is perfect. He is zealous. He loves. He knows his Bible. He loves God, and he is a Pharisee of Pharisees. Is now going to the Gentiles, like these godless, uncircumcised idol worshipers who have so many gods that they can't even keep track of them. This is the guy that God would send? Have you ever found yourself in a situation that was obviously orchestrated by God, and you are sitting there and you're going, really? God, this is where you have me? Are you insane? This is ridiculous. This is hard. This hurts. Because sometimes when God does something new, like he did with Paul, it is weird, and it is not what you'd expect, and it's hard. And this is why I think as God was doing something new with Paul, it ended up just breaking his heart as Paul then turns to the Gentiles. This is what Paul says about his love and his heart for his own people. This is from the book of Romans. He says, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my people, those of my own race, the people of Israel. Theirs is the adoption to sonship. Theirs the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of the Messiah, who is God over all, forever be praised. Amen. His heart has broken because his own people, the people who should know the Messiah, are refusing to believe. Sometimes when God does something new and he takes us along for the ride, we will find ourselves struggling and hurt. And sometimes that's just how it is. I was studying something very different at a very different school when I sensed that God was pushing me to start preparing for ministry. And so I ended up in Waco, Texas, of all places, and studying theology and knowing that this is where God is leading me. This is where God wants, what God wants me to do with my life. And I'll never forget, as I got into those studies, sitting there in my dorm, alone, and up till that point, I had never been so lonely, so frustrated, so empty and unfulfilled. And once I was able to be honest with myself, I was so angry at God. It's like, really, God, you're going to call me to do this, and now I am languishing here. Why would you do that? And I learned something important, that if you find yourself in that situation, and if God's calling you to do something new, you will find yourself in that situation. Big moments come when you realize you can actually be honest with God about your suffering and your anger. As it turns out, God is not particularly insecure. It's not like you're going to say, why would you do this? This is so hard. I can't believe, God, I am in so much pain. Why would you do this to me? It's not like God is saying, no, me? No, I didn't do that. How dare you say, no. God is infinitely patient. And if God calls you to this place, that maybe he's got something else in mind too, as you sit there and you find yourself unfulfilled and unhappy. Because sometimes God is very interested in transforming your heart too. So when God calls you to something new, and he will, and you struggle and you question and you doubt, maybe that's part of the process. But know that one day you will look back and you will say, oh, That's what you've been doing this whole time. Because God always redeems struggle. That is one way that God does something new. He changes our circumstances, changes our calling. He puts us in new and exciting and uncomfortable places. So now we turn to Colossians, and Paul is writing to these people in the city of Colossae, and he's doing a bunch of things, but here specifically, he says, "Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things, for you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." Now, we make a mistake when we read this if we think like, okay, so my mind on things above, God's like up there or something in the clouds, and so I need to think otherworldly, outside of the ins and outs of the day-to-day living. And that's not the message of the Bible. In fact, the whole message of the Bible isn't that we somehow escape off into heaven or we float away or our idea is to transcend our physical bodies. No, no, no. The story of the Bible is that God's presence comes to us. So when Paul is saying, like, set your hearts on things above, the idea is then so that the way God is and what it means to be in God's presence will then come down here and transform our reality here. Because what happens here matters. And he starts this section by reminding us that this is who you are. You have been raised to new life. And that's true of y'all too. My Texas is coming out. This is true for you. You are resurrection people. The same spirit, the same power that raised God from the dead, or raised Jesus from the dead, is raising you from the dead, transforming you and your heart. That is your reality. Now, with that in mind, he says, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways, in the life you once lived, but now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these. Now, hold that thought. That list there, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, all of those tend to refer actually to, like, they're all like sexual words. And we know that that was an issue in the church in Colossae because the Colossian Christians were people. And when you get people together, you are going to have those struggles and issues. But typical Paul, he is not just saying, hey, you're doing naughty things, so stop. Paul always has to twist the knife. He's saying, this is idolatry. Because when sexuality becomes about consumption, and this can happen even in the context of a marriage, it becomes like a kind of a god, something that you worship that isn't God himself. And when you worship something that isn't God, it's this other God, that God will demand sacrifice. And sacrifice is always human. It will destroy relationships, people, and yourself. But he's saying, like, that used to be you. Remember, that is not you anymore. So then he goes on. Rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. That filthy language, that's more like language that is abusive. It doesn't necessarily mean stop swearing or something like that. I fear the day that my microphone is on and I stub my toe or something like that. It's going to be awkward. But language that's abusive or does not express well, like, just stop. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices. Notice that he keeps coming back to that. He's not saying, hey, you're being naughty and stop, but he's saying this isn't you anymore. And that's true for you too. This isn't you anymore. And you have put on the new self, the resurrection self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Here, in the church, and even among us, there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian, Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative. There's no Trump, there's no Bernie, there's no Beto or other 48 people who are running for president. There's no gay, there's no straight, there's no immigrant, there's no citizen, there's no black, there's no white, there's no brown. In the church, anything that we might use to divide us from each other is dissolved. There's no slave nor free, but Christ is all and is in all. Now, that doesn't mean it's a free-for-all, because what Paul is saying here is that there are some things that we do not do here. But the ways that we divide ourselves has no place anymore. We live in Jesus. The story that God is telling about us has changed. God here is doing something new, but rather than putting you in a new situation, he is telling a new story about who you are. And when you tell a new story about who you are, that's how character is transformed. Interestingly enough, a lot of those things like anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language, like the way that Paul is constructing this, you can tell that those are the things that come out when there is a community that is dividing itself. And he is saying that, no, there's no more room for gossip. Stop assassinating each other with your words. Stop lying about each other. Let that go. Because you are resurrection people. The story of your life is one of being put to death in Jesus and being raised to new life. It's a new day. Therefore, as God's chosen people, in other words, like he's saying to Colossae, like all of that stuff, that like that's not who you are, even though you are struggling with it. But it doesn't change the fact that you are still God's people, because that's the nature of grace and forgiveness. Holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear like those long lists of things, like long lists of sins, it's like, okay, yeah, I guess that's part of my life, and yeah, I regret that. But there's sometimes like this hesitance, like how far is too far? Am I supposed to just sit there and feel bad? Or am I supposed to try and struggle and feel like a failure? Or do I look at some of those things and think, am I ready to give that up? Like, take the list of the 7 deadly sins. Like, once I get to like sloth and gluttony, it's like, but those are my favorite. That's why I like to go on cruises. But what Paul is saying here isn't that this is like he's not saying that the point of the church is to get together and feel bad about ourselves. It's about getting together and being honest about ourselves. But the point is that God has done something new and you are now different. You are God's chosen people. That stuff in your life is slowly but surely being chipped and burned away. Because you are people of the resurrection. That stuff has no place here. And there will be a day when that stuff is not here. But for now, the story that God is telling about you is one of empowerment and grace and forgiveness. So we put away that stuff because now you are compassionate, you are kind, you are humble, you are gentle, you are patient, and you are loved. Let's pray.